So the title of this presentation is Medical Views on Sexual Pleasure in the Renaissance, Interpreting Hippocrates' On Generation. So let's proceed to the introduction. Early modern physicians questioned who experienced greater pleasure in sexual intercourse, men or women. Far from being new, the discussion was inherited from classical authors who addressed the topic in different kinds of texts. In the specialized fields of philosophy, science, and medicine, Hippocrates, Aristotle, and Galen set up the lines of analysis. In their inquiries, the question was closely tied to the understanding of female physiology and the role of female seed in generation. Some of the questions they tried to answer were, do women possess one seed analogous to that of men? Is pleasure a condition for its emission and thus for conception? In the field of literature proper, canonical authors as Lucretius or Ovid helped to vulgarize and disseminate powerful ideas about the topic among wider audiences. The episode of Tiresias in Ovid's Metamorphoses, Book 3, became particularly important in the discussion about sexual pleasure. It goes like this. It is told that Jupiter, relaxed with nectar, put care aside, and stirred up Juno with loaded loose jokes in his spare time, and said, your pleasure is definitely greater than that which befalls males. She denies it. They agreed to ask well-informed Tiresias what opinion was his. Both Venuses were known to him, for once, with the stroke of his staff, he had injured the bodies of two enormous serpents mating in the green wood, and, marvelous thing to see, from man he turned into a female and spent 7 autumns like that. In the 8th, he saw the same serpents again and said, if such is the power of striking you that the condition of the striker changes to its contrary, now again shall I strike you. And the same serpents beaten, the previous shape returned as well as the birth figure. Therefore, taken up as the arbiter of the playful dispute, he confirms the words of Jupiter. Tiresias' transformation from male to female and back allowed for an informed comparison of the experience of sexual pleasure in both sexes and strengthened the idea that women have greater pleasure than men in intercourse. Yet Ovid's text does not define pleasure, nor explains how the term greater should be understood or why such a phenomenon should happen. In what sense can pleasure be measured and by what physiological mechanisms? Hippocrates' On Generation provided an alternative and more authoritative perspective on the matter, whereas Ovid states that women experience a greater pleasure. The On Generation 4 suggests the opposite view, that male pleasure is more intense and lasts longer. Renaissance physicians, editors, and commentators of Hippocrates confronted this tension directly. Girolamo Mercuriale, a pivotal figure in the debate that followed, tried to conciliate both authors by introducing a change in the text of On Generation, which he justified by manuscript evidence that inverted Hippocrates' claim. Men being hotter had greater, although shorter pleasure, while women being colder had lesser, slower, but more long-lasting pleasure. Mercuriales' version has long been accepted in modern editions of On Generation. This presentation, however, will demonstrate that some Renaissance physicians, as Estêvão Rodrigues de Castro, resisted his claim and offered reasonable arguments, both physiological and rhetorical, to contest that philological emendations. So let's move to an account of sexual pleasure in On Generation 4. The Hippocratic On Generation, de genitura, or perigonees, is reconstructed for the most part from the 2 most ancient manuscripts transmitting the text, the Marcianus Venetus Graecus 269, dated from the 10th to the 11th centuries, found today at the Biblioteca Nazionale Marciana in Venice, and the Vaticanus Graecus 276, dated from the 12th century and placed at the Biblioteca Apostolica in the Vatican. In section 4, of the On Generation. Both manuscripts provide the same reading of a specific dictum or saying about sexual pleasure. A woman feels much less pleasure in intercourse than a man, and a man feels it for a longer time. Most early modern editors followed this reading, namely Francesco Torresani, Janusz Cornarius, Jean de Gory, or René Chartier, to name but a few. Now, the 1579 edition of Theodor Zwinger, however, printed a different version of the saying, a woman feels much less pleasure in intercourse than a man, but feels it for a longer time than a man. This version added but one letter to the saying, then, but changed its meaning radically. It was very successful and directly influenced almost all of the subsequent editions of the text. It was adopted by Émile Littré's edition made in the 19th century, whose French translation reads, La femme a dans le cœur beaucoup moins de plaisir que l'homme, mais elle en a plus longtemps, and was well received in recent editions, translations, and commentaries, such as those of Robert Joly, Ian Loney, or Paul Potter. Rather than being Zwinger's own innovation, the text was given the form we find in modern editions in 1571 by Mercuriale, who claimed he had seen what he believed to be this more correct reading in an ancient manuscript. He says, in the same book of Hippocrates' On Generation, these words are found, etchon de poloedetai egunetu andros entemixei, pleionade chronon oner. That is, a woman feels much less pleasure in intercourse than a man, but the man feels it for a longer time. The last words, however, reads in an ancient manuscript, pleionade chronon oner. That is, a woman feels much less pleasure in intercourse than a man, but feels the pleasure for a longer time than the man does. Mercuriale further justified the correction, stating that the inherited text of On Generation did not harmonize well with the broader doctrine of men being naturally hotter and women colder. In his view, Hippocrates' claim made sense only if inverted. In intercourse, men being hotter have greater, although shorter, pleasure, while women being colder have lesser, slower, but more long-lasting pleasure. This raises two fundamental questions. Can we confirm Mercuriale's claim with the manuscripts available today? And two, does the reading he proposes make more sense in the Hippocratic text? On the first point, our research has found that the variant exists even if confined to a late marginal branch of the tradition. The Requentiores, that is, the more recent manuscripts, Vaticanus Graecus 278 from the 15th century, located at the Biblioteca Apostolica in the Vatican, and the Plutius 74.1, dated from 1512, and located at the Biblioteca Medicea Laurentiana in Florence, present the variation containing the comparative conjunction than. Typically, however, these manuscripts are omitted from modern editions because they appear to derive from manuscripts ultimately dependent on the more ancient and authoritative Marcianus 269 mentioned previously, which does not show the said comparative conjunction. Therefore, Mercuriale's claim can be confirmed only partially. Some extant manuscripts do present his readings, but they are not older than those of the Vulgate tradition. What they show is that the variant was probably introduced between the 13th and the 15th centuries. The second point made by Mercuriale is even more debatable, as we will see next. So let's move to our second session, reading the On Generation for, before, and with Mercuriale. Earlier copies and editors saw no incoherence in the received reading, women enjoy less and men enjoy longer. Jean de Goris's 1545 edition of On Generation exemplifies how the disparate doctrines of Hippocrates and Ovid could be reconciled before and without Mercuriale's proposal. The transmitted reading that men experience greater and longer pleasure is accepted and justified by the four causes of sexual pleasure, namely semen, movement, heat, and spirit. Men appear to experience greater pleasure due to humoral and physiological causes. They have hotter, sharper, and more abundant semen, move more strongly in intercourse, and possess more heat and spirit. Yet, a specific female cause of pleasure is identified, the uterus's desire and appetite for the semen of the man, which is likened to the stomach's appetite for food and drink. With this, Goris can conclude, with Tiresias in Ovid, that women's pleasure might, in some respects, be greater than that of men. His words are in the slide. But in a woman, there are other things to consider separately. Separately means in the woman alone, which, as I believe, can be counted among the principal and most important causes of venereal pleasure. For her womb is held by a great desire for the male seed, and it desires it in an extraordinary way, and by drawing, sucking, and conceiving it, takes the greatest pleasure. For in this respect, the womb is like the stomach, for just as the latter delights in sweet foods and drinks and embraces them most eagerly, so the former loves seed and has it most gladly, so that it may seem that the prophet Tiresias rightly gave his opinion on the question raised in Ovid. Goris mostly uses ideas from his predecessors like Avicenna, who in the canon first drew the list of the three sources of sexual pleasure in women: the expulsion of the semen, the absorption of the semen, and friction. Goris's text illustrates that the inherited medical doctrine could accommodate Tiresias's opinion by allowing a broader interpretation of the dictum found in non-generation, and by considering a specific source of pleasure in women which relied on the specificities of the female reproductive system. In any case, Goris's text shows that the medical views on sexual pleasure in females called for a re-evaluation of the saying found in the On Generation. It also highlights the groundbreaking intervention of Mercuriale, who adopted the humanist guidelines of his time and added a philological component to the discussion. Despite the minor incoherence that arises in interpreting the On Generation, which will be pointed out next, the philological argument supported the interpretation of the medical dictum of On Generation inherited from the Middle Ages, according to which men experience sexual pleasure more intensively, a concept linked to the category of quantity, while women feel it more extensively, a concept linked to the category of quality. Additionally, the philological insight is the reconciliation of Hippocrates' text with the story of Tiresias' transformation as told by Ovid, thus making the doctrine, which was scattered across different types of texts and authors, more coherent and palatable to a wider range of readers. Finally, it allowed Mercuriale to contribute to the humanist program of establishing the correct text of Hippocrates, whose gynecological books were first printed in Rome in 1525 by Fabius Calvus, and could from then on offer an interpretation which accorded with the spirit of the time. Mercuriale's proposal must have appeared as a breath of fresh air in the cultural atmosphere of his time, loaded with philological and literary interests. It had immediate impact on editors of Hippocrates' works and on medical writers. An example of the former is Theodor Zwinger, whom we mentioned already, who adopted Mercuriale's correction in his 1579 edition of Hippocrates' works. and explain his reasons in the commentary. An example of the latter is the Portuguese physician Rodrigo de Castro, one of several Medici Lusitani celebrated in Europe for the significance of their writings, who exemplifies how Mercuriale was positively received by authors publishing on the medicine of women in the 17th century. His The Complete Medicine of Women, published in Hamburg and Cologne in 1603, includes a discussion of several questions related to coitus, such as this. So he says, about coitus, of course, we will investigate in the first part of this book, what is its cause? Why do male and female desire the conjunction of each other? Whence comes the pleasure which is conjoined with it? Why is it perceived so great? And does it happen to a greater degree to a woman than to a man? What is its end? To what age, temperament, and nature is it more suitable? What manner is to be observed so that intercourse may be fruitful? Or what is the method of conjoining healthily? 3 of the questions relate to sexual pleasure. When answering the last question, does pleasure happen to a greater degree to a woman than to a man, de Castro prefers Mercuriale's solution. He says, most people of our time ask whether a man or a woman feels more pleasure in intercourse, and the question was once asked to the judge Tiresias, who awarded greater pleasure to women, considering that perhaps a woman lingers longer in it. And as Avicenna writes, she perceives 3 pleasures in intercourse. The first when she ejects her own semen, and then she is delighted as many times as she ejects it. The second by absorbing the man's semen, and the third when the uterus is moved. Although this is so, the opinion seems to be sounder of those who think that men perceive greater pleasure, since from their initial conformation they are warmer, consequently they have wider pathways, but spend less time in intercourse because they often ejaculate more quickly, or rather, as Hippocrates writes in his book on generation, they ejaculate suddenly with stronger agitation and disturbance than women, who, although they feel pleasure for a longer time, this is not due to a more intense pleasure, but because they ejaculate more slowly due to the structure of their pathways, or indeed sometimes they are not able to ejaculate at all. According to him, 2 reasons could support Tiresias' saying, namely that women feel pleasure for a longer time, or that they feel it in more ways, in expelling their own seed, in receiving that of the male, and in experiencing the movement of the matrix, as already stated by Avicenna. Be that as it may, he prefers to think that men, not women, experience a greater pleasure, and women a longer pleasure in intercourse, which according to him results from the different width of their vessels, arteries, etc. De Castro's text shows that the perception of sexual pleasure by men and women could be considered under the categories of duration, intensity, or mode, or ways, thus pointing to the increased degree of complexity introduced in the discussion since the Middle Ages. It also shows that the episode of Tiresias had become a commonplace in the discussion of sexual pleasure. Finally, it illustrates that Mercuriale's correction met the expectations of at least some medical authors in search of new ways to interpret the On Generation, Chapter 4. Not all specialists, however, found the proposal straightforward, and some raised strong objections against it. Estêvão Rodrigues de Castro, so the names are similar, but they are different men. One is Rodrigo de Castro, and he was working in Hamburg, and this one is Rodrigues de Castro. This was a Portuguese physician working under the Medici's patronage, much like Mercuriale. He disagreed with it in the Tractatus de Natura Muliebri, a work based on the notes of a course he designed for peasant students and posthumously published in 1654. In the dispute entirely dedicated to the topic, titled Whether the Man or the Woman Feels Greater Pleasure in Intercourse, he traced the history of the question using three names: Hippocrates, Avicenna, and Mercuriale. He first denies that Hippocrates and Avicenna speak of a more prolonged pleasure felt by women in intercourse. Instead, he defends that they point to the multiple and more varied sensations felt by women in intercourse related to the suction and friction of the matrix. This is the first objection against the proposal of Mercuriale. This reading, already made by Goris, made any correction to the text of the on generation superfluous. But the second objection is perhaps more powerful. He says, nevertheless, Mercuriale corrects the words of the Hippocratic text from an ancient manuscript where it is read that a woman feels less pleasure than a man in intercourse, but that she lasts longer in pleasure than he does. And he, Mercuriale, prefers this correction to the other reading, since he thinks it most true that a man who is hotter than a woman obtains faster movements, because of which he ends his desires more ardently and more quickly, but a woman, as she is colder in finishing her pleasure and lasts longer in it. The words of Hippocrates do show that this correction does not come from his mind, or from Polybius's, who is considered the author of that book. Namely, and now he quotes the On Generation, if she desires to have intercourse with a man, she ejaculates before the man, and for the rest, she will not feel, for the rest of the time, of course, she will not feel the same pleasure. But if she does not desire, she ceases to feel pleasure at the same time as man. And it is as when someone pours cold water into boiling water and it ceases to boil. By considering a larger tranche of the on generation, Castro highlights the inconsistency created by Mercuriale's claim that women inherently experienced longer lasting pleasure. When inverting Hippocrates' claim that men have greater and longer pleasure, Mercuriale reshaped the argument to align it with established physiological assumptions, namely with the broader accepted doctrine that women were colder and men hotter, and with Tiresias's assertion stated in Ovid's text as well. But inadvertently, he inserted a contradiction in the on generation, which had previously considered the whole sexual encounter and stated that women cease to feel pleasure before or at the same time as the man ejaculates. Rodrigues de Castro, therefore, downplays Mercuriale's argument and instead proposes a return to Hippocrates and Avicenna, whose texts imply that the feeling of sexual pleasure in women and men should not only be determined by temperamental differences, such as the idea that men are hotter and women are colder, but rather by psychosomatic factors like eagerness and the physical actions of suction and friction. Pleasure was seen as contingent on psychological and physical factors, and in this sense, each of the sexes would experience pleasure to a greater degree in its own way. This shows that the solution of Mercuriale was not accepted unanimously by all scholars. More important, it shows that Mercuriale's proposal introduces inconsistencies in the on generation and interprets the text in a way that might be foreign to its pristine sense. Rodrigo de Castro and Estêvão Rodrigues de Castro are just two examples illustrating how the interest in philology and literature proper of the late Renaissance contributed to discussing medical doctrines. On the one hand, having a correct version of the text of Hippocrates, implied having a correct and acceptable medical doctrine, and vice versa. On the other, a correct interpretation of the story of Tiresias implied making sense of it under the light of the accepted medical doctrine. These case studies show that the early modern scholars replicated old ways of analysis based on the study of classical canonical authors like Hippocrates, Galen, and Aristotle, but also promoted a constant revision of the received doctrine, a discussion of ancient cultural constructs, and the forging of new attitudes towards traditional ideas. The debate about sexual pleasure ultimately became a test case for the ways in which Renaissance authors engaged with philology. The reception of Mercuriale's emendation underscores the range of possible responses. Theodor Zwinger and Rodrigo de Castro adopted Mercuriale's solution, integrating it into a broader framework that justified women's supposedly longer pleasure through physiological and textual arguments. Estêvão Rodrigues de Castro, by contrast, rejected Mercuriale's reading, turning instead to Hippocrates in his older form and insisting on an interpretation grounded in the internal coherence of the Hippocratic text itself. All things considered, the persistence of the debate shows why the problem remained unresolved. The physiological mechanisms of sexual pleasure were opaque, and the measurement of intensity, duration, or mode proved hard to assess, as much as today. Modern research still pursues an answer to this scientific problem, which entails many other questions like the relationship between female orgasm and procreation, and the orgasm gap between the sexes, and others. Whether physicians accepted the theory of Tiresias or not is less important than the fact that by incorporating the story of Tiresias in the medical texts, physicians were forced to deal with far-reaching consideranda, such as that transformation is inherent in the world and generates new insights, or that the doctrine of sex may be subjected to transformation, or that sexual pleasure is a matter of negotiation, for the pleasure given is measured against the pleasure received, or even that the role of a physician is, as in the case of Tiresias, that of a judge in discussions about how the human body works, a position whose exercise demands the full comprehension of the bodily experiences and of attaining a perfect knowledge of how a body different than theirs perceives the world. And this is it. So these are some of the references used in the research to make this presentation. And I thank you all, and I end here. Thank you very much.